Liberalism section: The Irish, the Indians, and the Inhabitants of Java. The English colonists' revolt in America was accompanied by another major controversy. For a long time, like that of the blacks, the Indians' fate had not in the slightest unsettled the deep conviction of the English on either side of the Atlantic that they were the chosen people of liberty. In both cases, they appealed to Locke, for whom, as we shall see, the natives of the New World approximated to, quote, wild beasts. But with the eruption of the conflict between colonies and mother country, the exchange of accusations also encompassed the problem of the relationship with the Indians. England, Paine proclaimed in 1776, was, quote, that barbarous and hellish power which hath stirred up the Indians and the Negroes to destroy us, or to cut the throats of the freemen of America. End quote. Similarly, the Declaration of Independence berated George III for having not only, quote, excited domestic insurrections amongst us by black slaves, but also, quote, endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. End quote. In 1812, on the occasion of a new war between the two shores of the Atlantic, Madison condemned England for indiscriminately striking the civilian population with its fleet, not sparing women or children, and hence displaying a conduct similar to that of the red-skinned savages. Having been accomplices of the barbarians, the English became barbarians themselves. In fact, the argument had begun much earlier, following the Crown Proclamation of 1763, that sought to halt or contain expansion west of the Allegheny Mountains. This was a measure that did not please the colonists and George Washington, who regarded it as a, quote, temporary expedient, destined to be rapidly superseded, but which should not be respected even in the immediate present. Those, quote, who neglect the present opportunity of hunting out good lands were foolish. The future President of the United States was not one of these, quote, fools. In his new capacity, while declaring in official speeches that he wanted to bring the, quote, blessings of civilization and happiness to an unenlightened race of men, in private correspondence he identified the Indians as, quote, savages and wild beasts of the forest. Given this, the British Crown's pretension to block further expansion by the colonists was absurd and ultimately immoral. They, Washington declared in a letter of 1783, would force, quote, the savage, like the wolf, to retire. End quote. Even more extreme in this respect was Franklin, who, in his autobiography, observed, quote, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. It has already annihilated all the tribes who formerly inhabited the seacoast. End quote. The decimation or destruction of a people who worshipped, quote, the devil, was part of a kind of divinely inspired eugenicist plan. The dehumanization of the Indians was also subscribed to by those in Britain who supported reconciliation with the rebels. The Crown's attempt to block the colonists' expansionistic march seemed to Burke absurd and sacrilegious for, quote, attempting to forbid as a crime and to suppress as an evil the command and blessing of Providence, quote, increase and multiply. End quote. Ultimately, it was an ill-fated, quote, endeavor to keep as a lair of wild beasts that earth, which God, by an express charter, has given to the children of men. End quote. Those on either side of the Atlantic who supported or justified the Crown's policy of conciliation, not of the colonists, but of the Indians, mounted some resistance to this process of dehumanization. In this context, a particular mention should be made of the figure of the likable American loyalist, whom we have encountered several times, in his capacity as a critic of the peculiar libertarian zeal displayed by the harshest and wickedest slave masters. To these same circles he attributed cruelty to the Indians. Sometimes they were killed and scalped with veritable religious fervor. They even became targets for shooting practice. They were branded savages, and yet, objected Jonathan Boucher, they were no more savage than, quote, our progenitors appeared to Julius Caesar or to Agricola. End quote. We have seen Paine accuse the London government of seeking an alliance with Indian cutthroats. In reality, warned an English commander in 1783, it was precisely the now victorious colonists who, quote, were preparing to cut the throats of the Indians. The victor's behavior, added another officer, was shocking to humanity. This was an enduring controversy. In the later 19th century, a historian descended from a family of loyalists who had taken refuge in Canada argued as follows. Did the rebels claim to be the descendants of those who had disembarked to America to escape intolerance and stay loyal to the cause of liberty? In fact, reversing the policy of the British Crown, which aimed at conversion, the Puritans had initiated a massacre of the Indians, assimilated to, quote, Canaanites and Amalekites, that is, stocks marked out by the Old Testament for erasure from the face of the earth. This was, quote, one of the darkest pages in English colonial history, which was followed by the even more repugnant one written during the American Revolution, when the rebel colonists engaged in, quote, the entire destruction of the 6 Indian nations that had remained loyal to England, quote, by an order which, we believe, has no parallel in the annals of any civilized nation. Congress commands the complete destruction of those people as a nation, including women and children. End quote. In his private correspondence, at least, Jefferson had no problem acknowledging the horror of the war against the Indians. But in his view, responsibility for it resided with the London government, which had incited these savage, bloodthirsty tribes. This was a situation that, quote, will oblige us now to pursue them to extermination, or drive them to new seats beyond our reach. The, quote, confirmed brutalization, if not the extermination of this race in our America, was to be laid at Britain's door, as with the similar fate of the same colored man in Asia, as well as of the Irish, who, for the English, whose skin color they shared, should be brethren. It was attributable to a policy committed to sowing death and destruction, wherever Anglo-mercantile cupidity can find a twopenny interest in deluging the earth with human blood. End quote. Jefferson was not wrong to compare the treatment suffered by the Indians with that reserved for the Irish. Just as, according to the Loyalist accusation, Puritans and rebel colonists assimilated the Indians to Amalekites, so the Irish had already been compared to Amalekites, marked out for extermination, this time by the English conquerors. The colonization of Ireland, with all its horrors, was the model for the subsequent colonization of North America. If the British Empire as a whole mainly swept away Irish and blacks, Indians and blacks were the principal victims of the territorial and commercial expansion, first of the English colonies in America, and then of the United States. As with the black question, in the case of the Indians, the exchange of accusations ended up taking the form of a mutual demystification. There is no doubt that, along with black enslavement and the black slave trade, the rise of the two liberal countries, either side of the Atlantic, involved a process of systematic expropriation and practical genocide, first of the Irish and then of the Indians. Similar observations can be made of Holland. A senior English civil servant, Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, who during the Napoleonic Wars was deputy governor of Java for a time, stated that the previous administration was, quote, one of the extraordinary relations of treachery, bribery, massacre, and meanness, end quote. It is clear that colonial rivalry played a role in this judgment. Marx reports it, but pools, quote, Dutch colonial administration and the English administration in his condemnation. As regards Holland specifically, beginning of long quote from Marx, nothing is more characteristic than their system of stealing men in Celeb in order to get slaves for Java. The young people thus stolen were hidden in secret dungeons on Celeb until they were ready for sending to the slave ships. An official report says, this one town of Makassar, for example, is full of secret prisons, one more horrible than the other, crammed with unfortunates, victims of greed and tyranny, fettered in chains, forcibly torn from their families. Wherever the Dutch set foot, devastation and depopulation followed. Banjuwangi, a province of Java, numbered over 80,000 inhabitants in 1750, and only 18,000 in 1811. That is peaceful commerce. End quote. Once again, the processes of enslavement and practical genocide were closely intertwined. End section.